have a public discussion that will be available for future viewing and reflection about 2 books about the person whom Frances Alston named this house after, Paul Robeson. She saw that it was going up on the market, and after decades of working at the Free Library of Philadelphia on Vine Street, she said, no, this house is not going to go to some wealthy person, gentrifier, so to speak, so they could use it for their own private wealth building. This will be a space for the public. So this event is in Frances's memory. And my token of appreciation to Frances for allowing public spaces and places to be of education to the Black community, especially the children that may not know who Paul Robeson was. So how we're going to do it is I will speak for about 45 minutes now until 2 about one recent biography of Paul Robeson, written by Gerald Horne in 2016, published by Pluto Press. And then from 2 to 3, Chris Rogers is going to talk about a recent biography of Paul Robeson called No Way But This,
Yes.
by Jeff Sparrow. And I want to say thank you, Chris, for organizing, setting up, for allowing us to have finger food, for setting up the TV. Could you turn on the TV?
Yeah, I need to set up.
Thank you. And thank you, Chris, for setting up the laptop. I appreciate it. And I want to say thank you to Vernoka Michael and Sherry Howard for their awesome renovation of this space that has things that I have not seen here since a year ago. She has biographical information on Paul Robeson that includes photos of him, of his sister, of his brother, of his mother, Louisa Bastille. There's a whole table here called the Bastille family. And I am grateful to see, the education of Paul Robeson's life because of what Vernoka Michael and Sherry Howard has done to really enhance this. So I want to say thank you to them. And for those watching this, please take the time to visit the Paul Robeson house, to give to the Paul Robeson house. Ms. Michael has asked that before and after, and of course I agree wholeheartedly, with this talk that we ask people who come to donate. There is a small, clear plastic box that you can donate in because there is upkeep that the house requires, that we all know, the bills that has to be paid. So we want to honor the people who allowed us this space by giving back something. And for those who are watching, you can always give online at paulrobesonhouse.org. So the title of this talk is a very important book, and I chose to name it after a quote that Gerald Horne quotes at the end in the last chapter. He has a 10th chapter called Death of a Revolutionary. And in that chapter, he quotes a Jet article saying, "He loved America too well, but not wisely." Gerald Horne's Paul Robeson. And I thought it was important to subtitle the talk Gerald Horne's Paul Robeson, because this is the Robeson presented by Gerald Horne. Welcome. Is the Robeson that is different from Paul Robeson Jr., is the Robeson that is different from Martin Duberman. And you'll notice from Chris's talk will be the Robeson that is different from Jeff Sparrow. So it's a very interesting quote because ultimately there's a quote that I think is not true. And but it's very important because you should know what this is an important debate. This is what Robeson's life really represented, especially after what happened to him in 1949, when he said that Negroes in the United States should not fight in World War II, and how when he came back, the black press kind of turned against him. I'm always interested in that dynamic. And if you study Paul Robeson's life, for real, the reason I'm able to write a whole dissertation, welcome Denise, long time no see, I'm so glad to see you. The reason I was able to write a whole 400-page dissertation about Robeson was that particular dynamic between the bourgeoisie, the black bourgeoisie and Robeson, how they turned on him when he said, and how they were basically paid to turn on him, kind of like that battle royale scene. I compare it to Alabama when the white policeman ordered the black prisoners to beat Fannie Lou Hamer. That kind of dynamic there. And the inability of a black bourgeoisie person to tell their white patron, their white funder, no, I will not do that. Because the point that Robeson is making in terms of the necessity of not fighting when we're Jim Crowed at home is in fact true. So the first of all, there are lots of stuff out there. I'm a teacher, right? I'm a teacher at heart. My dad grew me and my sister up in a library we had in our basement, and I often saw him there. When we talk about understanding Paul Robeson, you get two perspectives, one from a film and then another from a book. Now the film gives you the surface. We're all into that right now. Black Panther just came out, which sparked some very necessary conversation on what black nationalism means, right? Wakanda is different from Cuba, which is different from the Congo. That's quite different. Films are from books. Books gives you the detail. Books give you the theory. It tells you what the person chooses to tell you about, tells you what theory they come from. So in book, as this image shows, you get much more below the surface, in-depth information. You get the context, you get the references, you get things that a film, cannot provide. So I wanted to just start with notable films on Robeson that I highly recommend. There are a lot of films, but the one film I recommend that everybody sees if you want to know something about him, a film, is St. Clair Born. Thank you, Jimmy. I was about to say Drake. St. Clair Born's film called Here I Stand. It came out in 1999 on PBS. It's narrated by somebody, I forget who's narrating, but that's an important film. Notable books on Robeson include Paul Robeson Speaks. I have that. That book has an excellent chronology. That came out 2 years after he died. Paul Robeson by Martin Duberman. And I saw it in the case here that Vernoka and Sherry has put up. That book is like 600, 700 pages. It is a thorough look. Dr. Tony Montero wrote a review that was rather scathing of Duberman's biography because I remember Dr. Montero saying Duberman was harsh on Eslanda. Now, I read that and I didn't exactly get that. But there are things that Duberman misses that Horne gets. For example, Horne quotes from the Daily Worker newspaper, which was a communist newspaper, and he talks about police in a way that Duberman is unable to, right? What Horne does, I'll talk about that. Anyway, that's a second notable book. The third notable book is the 2 volumes. Both of them are at least 150 pages. The first one was by his son, Paul Robeson Jr., called The Undiscovered Paul Robeson, Volume 1, An Artist's Journey. That goes up to the 30s when he goes to Spain. And then the second volume of Paul Robeson Jr.'s biography of his father is Quest for Freedom. And that's a powerful book that came out 9 years later by Paul Robeson Jr. Okay, so arguments. What I like to do in a review, or what I've learned over the past few years when writing book reviews, in academia they discourage you from writing book reviews, but in my opinion, book reviews are the most important of the original article in the original book. The book review is higher than the book, but in academia they tell you, you're not supposed to do book reviews. Nobody's going to look at that. That won't count to tenure, and it's true. But it's so crazy because books end up shaping, the culture. I'm looking at Sandy, who was given a whole lecture that I attended on myth making. If anything can make a myth, it's a book, right? The Bell Curve, Charles Murray's book that basically argued for inferiority among African people. So in a book review, I ask myself, what is the argument? and whether by the end of the book they fulfill what they initially said in the argument. And I will be the first to tell you, Gerald Horne absolutely accomplishes what he set out to do. He does. But I just question whether it is, whether that should be the thing one should set out to do. That's all I'm coming at it. So he does accomplish his main argument. He said, I want to begin with the chapter 1, then go to the 2 previous points above. Chapter 1, that third circle, if you will. The argument of this book is that you cannot fully appreciate how the Jim Crow system came to an end without an understanding of the life of Paul Robeson. I think that's absolutely true. Robeson pioneered the struggle against Jim Crow throughout the 1930s and 1940s. It was only with Robeson's fall that, I'm sorry, that should be a G instead of a D, that King and Malcolm could emerge as they did. And he proves that. But it's based on two premises that I think are off. The first premise that's off in that quote is when he said, the Jim Crow system came to an end. And I think if we think about books, like Michelle Alexander books, we know that Jim Crow system has not come to an end when we think about what Michelle Alexander has argued in her book about the new Jim Crow. Okay? And then the second premise that's a little faulty is that it was only with Robeson's fall that King and Malcolm could emerge as they did. You know, seeing history as these individuals. You know, Black Freedom Movement is not composed of an individual, then, you know what I'm saying? That's never how it was. And so that's why I appreciate Barbara Ransby's theoretical frame. And she's the first person that came, she was like the elephant looming in my head when I was reading this book, because I was like, theoretically, I'm not agreeing with Horne, but he's still giving good information. What Barbara Ransby wrote excellent biographies of Eslanda Robeson, Paul Robeson's wife, and Ella Baker, who was one of the founders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. This is a quote from her work on Eslanda that came out 5 years ago. When she writes about Eslanda, Barbara Ransby says, "This story is also in part about me. It is biased." Right? Every person is biased when they write something in favor of my curiosities and questions, my passions and predilections, and it is subject to my judgment calls and assessments of what matters and what does not. So what matters to Horne, you know, is this idea that the Jim Crow system has come to an end, which, as you know, one could argue it has not really when we think about the police state emerging, and what's most offensive that I know Robeson would rail against is austerity. I'm looking at Sandy, who I know works in the public school system. The resources in the public sector just shrinking. Teachers available to students shrinking. You know, shrinking, whereas other sectors growing, private sectors growing, particularly for prison. He says later in his first chapter, in his close comrade, William Patterson, this is what I appreciate about Horne, declared Paul Robeson was a revolutionary, right? And if you know Patterson, he was a communist, right? And so I'm looking at how, because I identify, you know, as a Marxist, Leninist, communist. So how does Horne look at Robeson is what I ask. How does one look at somebody, you know, in kind of book review form? Horne says Patterson quotes, Patterson saw Robeson was a revolutionary determined to deploy Robeson's talent on behalf of constructing a socialist commonwealth, not just in the US, but worldwide. So a connection between workers in the United States with the workers in Africa. A connection between workers in the United States with the workers in the then Soviet Union. A unity across workers along the world. I'm looking at, thank you, Ted, and I saw him at a Workers' World event yesterday, right? And I picked up one of the papers and it said in Spanish, Mundo Obrero, You know, the idea that there is a possibility to create unity across class, something that Paul Robeson talked about in many speeches, especially after the 30s. Horne, however, does not identify himself so much as a strict communist. That doesn't mean you should read the book. Please read the book. I remember seeing him on Book TV on their in-depth program 2 years ago. And he says, I'm a democratic socialist. So this whole quest, the next few slides I have, 6 slides, we'll talk about how Horne seeing Robeson as a socialist kind of affects, to Barbara Ransby's point, what he thinks is important, what Horne thinks is important, as opposed to what I know through my knowledge didn't get mentioned, what also deserves mention. His second chapter is called Rising Star, right? And this chapter talked about the Emperor Jones, which was kind of Robeson's breakout film. He got that role after performing in Shuffle Along. They just did a revival of it in '23. And it's Landa, who he met, in the context of New York, kind of helped his burgeoning career after he was thinking he would be a lawyer and was told in no uncertain terms by the secretary, I don't take dictation from niggers. So he chose another field, but it was really Eslanda's presence and her being a manager and her getting gigs for him and her seeing that the audience connection between him and his singing could create a space for the two of them that really helped land him the role in Eugene O'Neill's play. When Horne writes about the Emperor Jones in Harlem, all he has to say, basically, Horne does about the Emperor Jones, is that the film did well in Harlem. And yes, there's so much more to that. When you look at the film is basically a cautionary tale, if you will. I'm thinking about a white audience, for white people against Marcus Garvey, because it's the story of this former Pullman porter who becomes head of this nation. And the end kind of shows him as a maniac. And so people saw The Emperor Jones as a good film, but we have to redefine what good means. Is it good because it shows when black people start to assert their own power, they're dangerous? Because that was the self-conscious message of The Emperor Jones. This really spoke to me, when Horne said the film did well in Harlem. I remember, this is a letter to the editor of the Negro World paper founded by Garvey. And this woman writes to the Negro World editor, who at that time was Hubert Harrison in 1920. And this woman is telling Harrison, Mrs. Corby is her name, that Harrison had no place praising the Emperor Jones. She says, such men as Mr. Harrison, who encourage white playwrights by lauding them to the skies, are of no racial value to the Negroes. Remember always the man who allows a man to make a fool of him will always be a fool. Charles Gilpin, he was the actor who played Brutus Jones, the star, before Robeson did. Charles Gilpin has won fame in Emperor Jones. Now let them bring him back in one of the higher plays and see how long he will remain on the Great White Way. The time has come when Negroes will not accept such plays as great. Right? And she's talking about the Emperor Jones. This is an important, the work that Robeson was doing was really causing, conversations as like this. And the more he did it, the more he saw, he felt more and more responsible for making sure that his role is positive and reflects positively on black people. At this time, he goes to England and starts to perform, particularly in Othello. And there, upstairs in the display Chris told me about, is an old copy of one of the later productions of Othello. It was an RPM with him and Uta Hagen. It looks like it's the audio of it. I'm afraid to even play it because it might fall apart. I don't know if there's any professional preservers of that record, but I would love to hear that recording of the Othello with Uta Hagen, and that was from the 40s. But he began playing it in the 30s in Moscow. While in England, Horne writes, Robeson came to know many Africans. Azikiwe, Nnamdi Azikiwe from Nigeria, and Kwame Nkrumah from Ghana, and Jomo Kenyatta from Kenya. They were all students there, while he also was taking classes at the School of Oriental Studies in England. Robeson subsidized the budget of the West African Students' Union. As Robeson, this is what I appreciate about Horne, talking about the growing consciousness. Similar to Garvey, when Garvey was here 20 years prior, something was happening in his mind where he could see the potential that these black immigrants from coming to the mother country, the European mother country, had in being able to change, go back to where they've come from for the positive, to make it less directly influenced by Europe and more influenced by the black class that are growing up there. Less colonial, not completely anti-colonial, but that's definitely an apt adjective for what Azikiwe, Nkrumah, and Kenyatta was trying to do. They were anti-colonial. Robeson meeting them, going to Moscow, seeing Patterson in Moscow, who called him a revolutionary, influenced Robeson's acting choices, particularly in cinema. Mrs. Robeson made it clear, I was telling Chris today earlier, that her spouse would rather play Denmark Casey than Porgy. You know, Porgy, the popular musical with the James Baldwin called Porgy a cripple. You know, but you could tell stereotypically this is what black people were kind of shepherded to be, roles like that. He would rather play, and he was meeting people like a filmmaker named Sergei Eisenstein who wanted him to play Toussaint and wanted to play the Haitian Revolutionary. He was in conversation that, and according to a lot of biographers, it just never materialized. And I know somebody in this world has things like what we saw upstairs, you know, and hopefully there's a way to preserve it and teach the younger generation what that kind of art is and why it's significant. This kind of dynamic that Horne talks about in the 4th chapter always reminds me of the efforts and the pains Abraham Lincoln took to separate enslaved from the free blacks, because that's the ultimate threatening conversation. Once that conversation happens, the southern slave owner is over. You know, because the slave in his mind is like, oh, I can do that, I have to be free, oh, great. So Abraham Lincoln's plan to deport all free blacks to Liberia was more about eliminating free blacks from the United States. And when you look at Robeson's life, his father defied that, he defied that. And I think the element of the free black conversation, which is especially relevant here in Philadelphia with what William Still was trying to do, comes up the way that Horne talks about how William Patterson changed him. Of all the people, the one who radicalized him the most was not somebody who was from a place outside the U.S., but from the U.S. in another country, and that was William Patterson. Paul went over for long talks, which left an indelible impression upon the artist who was becoming a revolutionary. In fact, those looking for a single day in which one can pinpoint when Robeson turned to revolution, it would be on this day in late December 1934. Okay, so that is a day where, if you will, and when we talk about revolutionary, you know, I'm just throwing that word out. I'm throwing it out because it is the subtitle of the book, but I want to be very clear in this video what I mean by that. I think James McCartney, in his book Black Power Ideologies, theorized that the best. A revolutionary is one who believes in calculated acts of violence to overturn the private property ownership of whoever's there before the revolution. So Cuba, if you will, accomplished revolution. Let me think. Elizabeth Nunez is a novelist, not a historian, but the way she writes about what happened in Trinidad, but it's in a kind of mocking way. It's not a revolution. So in other words, the granting of independence from England to its colonies is not revolution. That has to be really, and so what Robeson was really about was encouraging revolution. And I'm saying this as a child of Black Jamaican immigrants, but still aware of the important influence that Jamaican immigrants have had on Canadian history, U.S. history, Mexican history, Panamanian history. So I want to be clear on what I mean by revolution: calculated acts of violence, to carry that out. Che Guevara, Fidel Castro committed calculated acts of violence to overthrow the ownership of the land in Cuba. Robeson's work was going in that direction because of his conversation, long, impressionable conversations with William Patterson. Patterson pressed Robeson to return to the U.S. to join the struggle against Jim Crow. We kind of saw James Baldwin and Angela Davis, if you look at their biographies, go through the same thing. They're at a moment in Europe or England, and somebody tells them something, and they go back. Baldwin was in France, Angela Davis was in Germany, Robeson was in Russia in May 1935, but he went to England before the U.S. for good. He received reviews for his performance as a stevedore, as an emblem of his developing socialist ideology. So remember the slide I mentioned, Eslanda saying that his roles will no longer be Porgy, but more toward Denmark, BC.